Today's guest is Mollye Rhea, founder and president of the cause marketing agency For Momentum. Mollye, what a pleasure to see you, particularly on such an interesting occasion of some new research. So welcome, welcome, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you again, and I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it myself because it is a time of change, and I know you've got some very interesting insights. Well, let's start from the very beginning then, because
Mhm.
For Momentum has monitored trends in corporate partnerships and their collaborations with nonprofits for over a decade now. So, just on average, what do you look at when you do your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we really follow the trend of what our clients and friends are asking about. So we're a very operations focused agency. And so we're really looking for that practical information that is going to guide strategy development and partnership, advancement. So actually, we produce a piece of research every year. We are always looking for different subjects that are going to highlight different aspects of social impact partnership. This particular study, which is a survey of the corporate partnership decision maker from the corporate side of the partnership equation, this is actually, Deborah, the fourth time we've done this study. So we did it in 2015, 2018, 2022, and then just in spring, February through March of 2025, which of course is an opportune moment in time because there's so much change going on.
Yeah, and the other moments when you stated those dates, I think that we're always looking at what was pre-COVID and post-COVID or during COVID. So you probably have quite an interesting amount of information that's going through a number of trending pieces. But before we go past, let's look
Mhm.
present and future. Um, is there a key headline or perhaps a key trend from your latest study that really screams out at you?
Yeah. Um, I would say there are two key headlines I mean, there's a lot of great data, and I know we'll have a robust discussion of it. But if I had to choose the two headlines, the first is that amidst all of this change, there is a forecast of stability from the corporate decision makers on their commitment to nonprofit partnerships. So we asked the question, specifically, do you expect to keep your commitment to nonprofit partnerships steady? Do you expect them to increase or decrease? And we found that 73% do predict stability. We then asked an additional question that is sort of a first cousin to that data point, if you will, and that is, do you expect the number of partners that you support to remain stable, to increase or decrease? And again, 72% did say that they expect stability. But we did see a difference in the increase decrease numbers. So we saw that I believe it was 23% of the respondents did expect to decrease the number of partners while keeping their overall commitment stable. So what that tells me, Deborah, is that nonprofits are it's going to be vital for nonprofits more than ever before to demonstrate impact, because if they are keeping their commitment stable but potentially decreasing the partners, I believe the ones that will drop would be the ones that aren't showing their return on investment and their impact. So that's sort of headline number one, if you will. And then it's on everybody's mind. So I want to I want to go ahead and address this head on. What is happening to DEI? That is the other headline because of all of the news of this administration, and I don't need to repeat all the things going on in the landscape, but we did ask flat out, do you expect your commitment to DEI to continue to increase? And we saw that 36% of respondents, that's over a third, do expect to increase their DEI commitments. However, that's a 46% drop in what we saw in 2022. Now, in 2022, when we did our survey, it was just obviously post pandemic and importantly post George Floyd, when we saw a tremendous influx of companies increasing their commitments. So the decrease is understandable and expected, but I know it's what your listeners are going to be listening for. So I want to just cue that up right at the top.
No, you make some good points, and I think you're absolutely right that you had to look at that. And I think we were both at a conference where someone did talk about it's the works, not the words. So I think that we're going to see a lot of different things. What I find very interesting about your numbers about that corporate stability in their commitments is that it does seem that elements of purpose, and purpose certainly comes from the support of nonprofits that can amplify a brand's power and so on and so forth. It does seem that stability is shows how ingrained, let's say, over the last decade, these new concepts or just renewed concepts of purpose have made a real difference to how corporations think. So I think that it sounds like you're right on target in terms of just sentiment that's out there. Now, this is kind of an odd question given what we've just discussed, but is this the first time you've seen, such a big shift in terms of response to some rapid policy changes or just overall uncertainty?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really timely question because I think those of us that are in any space for a long time look at the current moment, but are always trying to put that into a historical perspective. And so, I would say the biggest change that I personally have seen in my career was the post 2008 time period. And that is obviously, there was a lot of, just to succinctly say it, Main Street versus Wall Street, a lot of that kind of sentiment that we're actually sort of seeing again today um, lately. And I think it was really interesting because, as budgets or as the economy was on decline, we really, I think a lot of us expected partnerships to be on decline, and we saw an inverse graph. It was actually companies doubled down more than ever before. And I think it was because they really needed something positive to point to. There was so much negative going on, and that's conjecture on my part, just as a practitioner. It wasn't a statistic that we captured, but I will say that what our stats show in that same line of thinking is that now more than ever before, companies realize this is not just a nice little marketing promotion. This is something that they have to do. And in fact, our 2025 research shows that 89% of the corporate respondents said that CSR is becoming more of a requirement than a nice to have. And so they are really seeing, I think this is why we're really seeing companies remaining stable with their commitments.
No, you make a good point, and that's an interesting comparison. And I think any of us who live long enough know that history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it kind of spirals and picks up some of the past and goes in a new direction. Well, you have some terrific statistics there. So why don't we review some of the key findings? And I'd also love your continued recommendations to what both the corporate side and the nonprofit side can do, because I think those insights are so valuable. But all right, so let's just some great questions here, just
Sure.
typical ones. So what are you finding in terms of ongoing partnerships in this environment? You made an interesting point about the number of partnerships going down. Now, is there anything else? Are you seeing any other potential changes? Are people looking for new partners? Are there new sectors? What, yeah.
Yes, as a matter of fact, but all of the above, and we can kind of unpack it, question by question, because I personally am a total data nerd, and I'm going to try not to nerd out on you with, too many stats. I'll try to, group it so that it's palatable. But first and foremost, in terms of ongoing partnership and sort of this continuing theme of it not being just a, nice to have little cute promotion, which is really, I believe, where we began back in the 80s, was just a cute little marketing promotion. And now it's so much more than that. And so we literally asked the question of these corporate decision makers, how long are your current partnerships? What's the average length? And we found that nearly 60% of our respondents reported partnerships lasting between 2 and 6 years. So these are certainly not long-term commitments. And another 13% said that they last 7+ years. So I think, for any partnership, I would put this up against any marketing strategy. It's not common for marketing strategies to remain consistent for that long period of time. And so I think it really says something. Only 12% of our respondents reported just annual 1 year commitments. So they really are looking to make that longer term commitment to an issue.
And I also think that as you go on with these type of partnerships, because they tend to be very active, they involve people, they involve employees, and so on. I think that you get greater richness, as you go on. There's almost part of a discovery phase or something, and it just continues. And I think that there's really something to be said for not only the endurance, but probably the new elements that come in as you start layering more and more on these. Well, let's also take a look at, unless you want to comment any more on that, let's take a look at purpose, if that's okay with you now.
Sure, sure.
You've surveyed companies about their attitude toward purpose. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've learned?
Yes. This is an area of the study that we focus on, and we really carefully keep the same wording because we want to benchmark, the changes over time. So I said it earlier that 89% of companies know that CSR is more of a requirement than a nice to have. Really important other statistic also, 89% believe that being a purpose-driven company drives profit. And so, it's one of these 90-10 issues, that we're hearing talked about. So if you know that it's going to drive profit, and that it's more of a have to do than a nice to do, all of those are flavoring to attitudes. And then one additional stat I'd like to bring in, Deborah, is the thought about employee integration. Because we know, especially post pandemic, we saw a tremendous spike in companies looking not only to influence consumer audiences, but also employee audiences. So we asked the statistic and we are able to benchmark it, this year versus 2022. We see that 80%, 89% also agree that being a purpose-driven company drives employee morale. And so that's really important. And it can't just be any partnership. 80% of these decision makers say understand that the partnerships need to be authentic. Like there needs to be a reason why 1 + 1 = 3 and not just it's like, why are they supporting that? It needs to be a natural alignment. And back to the employee audience, 77% believe that having the right partner helps with employee retention. So again, there's always for this type of corporate funding, nonprofits need to understand that there's always a business goal that needs to be front and center in negotiating these agreements because there is a responsibility to the companies, to their stakeholders. And so while they know they need to do it, it needs to be authentic, it needs to provide return on investment, it needs to generate impact. And they are looking at measures such as being able to demonstrate their CSR commitment and being able to retain their employees. So there's always an additional measure that has a business factor to it.
No, you make a good point. And I think as employees get younger, it's even
Mhm.
more important. Um,
Right about
excuse me.
that.
Um, I'm curious, are you finding any purpose message fatigue? People are talking about, oh, I'm so tired of it.
Um, well, I haven't met anybody that's saying, they're so tired of it, but there is that rumor.
Maybe it's a rumor. We'll have to put an end to it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm going to go off our study and just talk about some general things. There has been this sort of, you know, shadow cast on, oh, consumers are, having fatigue and they don't want to be asked to donate at the register. And, they're getting tired of that. And, we're being asked to tip people. And now we're being, in addition to, so there's a lot of discussion of that. And literally, like I was reading email before our appointment here today, and EFB Engage for Good just launched their giving at the register study. So I am anxious to read it in greater detail, but they did share headlines of that at the recent conference. And there are not signs of fatigue on the consumer side. And in fact, a point that you made is an excellent one, which is that more than ever before, or more than any other audience, Gen Z loves this stuff. And so companies want to influence Gen Z both as consumers and employees. And I think that's part of why there isn't so much fatigue. So anyway, I will say, um, uh, even though the general trend, I don't think there's fatigue. If I were to pick a nuance within the topic, I do think it's incumbent upon nonprofits to keep it fresh. Because while companies do want to support a particular mission sector, as we talked about for years, that doesn't mean they want to do exactly the same thing every year. They want to continue it to advance their ability to generate impact in a mission space, but they are looking for fresh ideas. And we asked that question in particular, sort of a scorecard or report card on how are your nonprofit relationships doing. And they're doing well. I mean, the general stats are very positive, but the one area where there was room for improvement was bringing fresh and unique ideas. So
No, I
I do
think
think
that's
that's,
an excellent point, and I think that you're also finding that there's even new ways of giving. I mean, you mentioned Gen Z, and I think there's a lot to be said about doing something very simple to do good and make yourself feel good. Every time you go to the grocery store, they now ask every week something different. Would you like to give to this or to that? And
yeah,
it's a roundup or it's $2 or something like that, and you feel like sometimes you just walk with a little bit more, you walk out of the store with a little bit more of a spring in your step. And
yeah.
yes, that can
And
get
it's attainable.
tired. That can get tired, but I think that, like everything today, innovation matters. And it doesn't matter if you're on the corporate side, on the nonprofit side, anything that you're doing, you've really got to listen to what customers want, but you also, you're right, have to have fresh ideas.
Mhm.
Well, give us a more practical element to that, and maybe you could walk us through your findings or your own experience on how companies choose nonprofit partners. I mean, who decides? What's the criteria for working with a nonprofit? And I think we've touched on this a little bit, but is the goal long term or does it start opportunistically and then become long term?
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of great questions, and I'm going to unpack them, a little bit one by one. So first and foremost, when what companies tell us is that when they are seeking the selection of a nonprofit partner, the number one factor is brand mission alignment. So 91% seek brand mission alignment, and 85% want tangible results in the overall match, right? They want to know that it's really making a difference. So I think that's first and foremost. And what I say to my corporate clients is if you have a brand mission focus, there are multiple partners that can help you accomplish that. And so we actually have like a service where we help them vet and find, the optimal partners that are going to help them reach their goals. What I say to my nonprofit clients is as you're developing your pipeline, don't stretch out so far that you can't even explain what you see the connection is. A company, I have so many nonprofits, and it's just human nature. If they're in Chicago or Seattle or Atlanta, as an example, they're expecting the top companies that are headquartered there. Well, obviously, they should support me because we're both in said city. That's not enough. Like there has to be that brand, what we call your partner value proposition. What is it about your unique partnership offering that is going to make you as a nonprofit the right fit within the mix of nonprofits that a company may be supporting in that mission space? So that's a little bit about some of the criteria. You asked a good question too about decision makers, and I want to come back to that question, Deborah, because it's an excellent one. And this is something that has really we're tracking this because it continues to evolve over time. In 2022 and again in 2025, we saw over 8 departments being involved in the decision-making process. So, I mean, it's, CSR, marketing, PR, senior management, the usual suspects, also HR, also legal, also finance. I mean, it makes sense, right? Because these are business investments and they have to be considered. But when we asked the question, who all is involved, and then we asked the next question, which is who are the top three, so that we can get a sense of priority. And this year, the top three were CSR, Marcom, and senior leadership. We are seeing that senior leadership number increase year over year, just increasingly more important that senior leadership are involved in paying attention to these. Now, sometimes nonprofits think, oh, I'll just have my board introduce me to the CEO and then I'm in. And that's not the way it works. You have to first get the buy-in of the proper departments and then work your way up to the C-suite. It's, the C-suite has to approve it, but they're not your only decision maker. And then last but not least, this is a factor that we are seeing. It's sort of what I'm calling a dark horse topic within the topic of decision making. We asked the question about partnership selection, and number 5 on the list was the cost of the sponsorship package. Now, that seems really obvious, but it was not as big of a factor in our previous study. In fact, 79% of respondents said of the package was a factor, and it was number 5. That's up 25 points versus our 22 study. So the nonprofit organizations need to understand, those that think they can go in with a big partnership minimum commitment out of the gate, or those that feel like they can go in and ask for a 6 or 7 figure commitment out of the gate. I don't think this is the environment to do that. I think this is an environment to meet them where they are and grow through strategic partnership alignment, because they are considering costs more than they were 3 years ago.
No, that's a very good point. I mean, all of your points on this are just so helpful. But I also think that it goes back to almost how we began. It really talks about the stability of this, because when something becomes more public facing, and let's be honest, a lot of these collaborations, not only help the nonprofits, but they certainly, magnify the intention of a lot of corporations, and you can't get anything more important than that. So if there's so much public image involved, of course, not only are there a lot of decision makers, but there's a lot of considerations. And what's the investment? The mere fact that we're talking investment is starting to show that there's dedicated budgets, and the mere fact that we're talking about measuring results is a good thing. It's
Oh,
actually a good thing.
absolutely.
So I think that that's pretty interesting. Let me go for a simple question here. What are
Mhm.
some of the main categories, and I'm not sure I'm even using the right words,
Yeah.
that receive the most corporate giving? I mean, is it hunger? Is it disaster relief, education?
That's a great question. And we call it mission sector, but that's a made up word on our part as well. So, we ask the question, what categories of mission are you trying to impact? And they're allowed to pick as many as they are supporting, because most companies do not support just one. They support multiple, and that's a stat within itself. But within that, we asked the question, and we gave them, we narrowed it down to about 15 categories, and that's still not enough to real, but we didn't want to have like exhaustion on our respondents. So we identify these categories, and we ask them, which of these are you giving to, is how we kind of ask the question. And then we allow an open-ended space for other, and our other is like a big number, and they list all the other things that weren't mentioned. But with all that said, our top 3 in the 2025 study were youth development at 55% of companies supporting that. 49% report supporting health, and 43% report supporting hunger. Rounding out the top 5 is interesting, because tied at 39%, exactly the same amount, were 3 topics. So I'm saying there's a tie for fourth, and that was education literacy, disaster relief and recovery, and mental health. Now, mental health, we added for the first time. So it's our first stat on that one, just because we've seen so much interest in that in our own practices. So I wanted to add it so we can begin to benchmark it. And then rounding out the top five at 37% are environment and children's hospitals. So a lot of different, all of these are above, 37%, as high as 55%. So a lot of support for these categories. The other headline, and I touched on this in an earlier question, is the decline in DEI. So 33% said that they support DEI, and that is a third of companies, which is great, but that is down from over 50% in our previous study. Now, personal opinion, our previous study in 2022, there was a spike in it, right? It was post George Floyd, it was post pandemic, and everybody was jumping to that awareness, jumping to the mission space because of the awareness that had been generated. And we had already started to see in 2023 and 2024, before inauguration, let's just say, there was already a decline in things like I have a DEI officer in my C-suite. They were already starting to make changes. So this is not 100% this administration. It was all the trend, it spiked and it was already coming down. So I just think that's important to note. And we always try to benchmark our data against, industry-wide data.
So I have a question for you then.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can answer this because DEI is a newer term. And what was the figure prior, 2 studies ago? What was the
Yeah.
figure prior? I mean,
That's a
I
great
don't know
question.
that we called it diversity, inclusion,
Yeah.
equity, and inclusion. I don't know what it was called now I
Yeah.
think about it.
And you raise an excellent point. And even though this is the fourth time we've done this study, it's evolved and grown. We never asked that question, what mission space, until 2022. So my benchmark is only 2022 versus 2025. So that's important to note. And I would be remiss, and I want to make sure I make this really vital point, that what we are hearing outside of the survey, I just led a summit, a senior leadership summit of nonprofit leaders at Engaged for Good. And we had, I think there were 58 organizations represented. So it's not a survey, but it's a feedback. More and more companies, it's not that they're walking away from the mission space altogether, but they are talking about it differently. So there is an active practice that is being implemented in 2025 to remove trigger words. Just I'll say it bluntly, remove trigger words and move more towards inclusion and other words. So it still gets, I mean, the bottom line is, within the health number, a huge number of companies are supporting health. And within that, there are disparities. So yes, they are impacting inequities, but they're not, leading with the
Yeah,
word
and no,
DEI.
you make an excellent point because I was thinking about the categories and health versus mental health or whatever it is, but I also know from one of the events that we were at together, the American Heart Association, which is probably one of the major beneficiaries of those nonprofits in your health space. They were talking a lot about differences in health among Americans within even a 20-mile radius, and just how there has to be better ways of making sure that all people in all neighborhoods, are doing better. And there's not language connected with that. It's about doing the best for Americans, regardless of income, regardless of background, regardless of anything else. And I think as they start their second 100 year, that was an interesting priority. Do you say that DEI necessarily? I think, you're just saying you're trying to do the best for all people. And
Right.
that is, that's also a good thing. So you're right about
Yeah.
triggers, you're right about accountability, but, let's also stick to the research. I mean, what we're seeing are trends, and some trends go up, some trends go down, but more importantly, some trends are reworded and redefined. And you joked before about that's a word we made up. Well, I think that as long as people can communicate clearly what they're saying, they're best to stay away from words that don't authentically describe it, you know.
Right.
So I mean that I know
Yeah.
we're on a whole nother area, but let's go back to now we've talked in some ways about challenges, but let's just formally say, what are the biggest challenges facing these types of partnerships? It sounds that some are misperceptions, some are recognizing that there's not enough data or results information. But tell me, what do you find?
Yeah.
I mean, you're the
You know,
expert.
it's such an important question, Deborah, that we literally asked this question almost exactly as you've worded it. It is a direct question in our survey. So I'm just going to pull the statistics. And so we asked, what is the primary challenge that you face in these nonprofit partnerships? Number one, budget. 39%, I believe it was 39% said there was a budget issue. Resources and capacity, 27%. And a tie for third at 11% was nonprofit requirements and management commitment. So, we talked about how the senior management is important and they're part of the decision, but getting their commitment can sometimes be tricky. So, budget, obviously that makes sense. And it aligns with the previous question that I answered where they are looking more at the cost of the packages these days. But I want to talk about resources and capacity because there's a big misnomer that, at least, I work with both nonprofits and companies, and the nonprofits think that the companies have deep pockets and endless resources. They feel that they are the under-resourced partner in the equation, and that's not true. I mean, it is not uncommon for huge companies, and I'm not going to name names, but very large companies to have a one or two person department managing all of this. So the resources and capacity, 27% say that's a big challenge. So what this says to me is a nonprofit partner, you better make it easy to work with you. Don't put a lot of hurdles and difficult activation things on the corporate. Find out how they activate and then make it easy for them within their culture to activate it. Don't expect them to do your backflip. Learn to do theirs. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's incumbent on nonprofits to make it as easy to work with as they possibly can.
No, I think that you brought up something really important because I think that we know with even the best of intentions, if there isn't some muscle behind it or some alignment of people, whether
Mhm.
that's in just even knowledge within the company that it's going on, whether it's people to execute, it does become daunting. And I think that the best partnerships now also have a lot of complexity to them.
Yeah,
And they do need to make sure that they work like a well-oiled machine, and that's not easy. That's not
yeah.
easy. So I think that you raise a good point, and I think like everything you offer good advice to both sides. And again, I know that it's not a nice to have, but perhaps people don't realize that this is not necessarily the core business of a
Right,
corporation. I'm not saying that it can't enhance its business, but at the
right.
same time, they align the number of people based on their business requirements. So, it
Yeah.
becomes, very difficult. And we have seen some great examples like Mattel and their foundation. They seem to be very well staffed, but again, that's been going on for decades now. So,
Mhm.
it's interesting. Okay, so in summary, because I have a feeling we could both go on until neither of us have a voice.
Right.
But but in summary then, what is your best advice to both sides of the equation, to the companies themselves and or the brands, and to the nonprofits?
Yeah. Well, to both audiences, I think my headline would be don't let the news cycle spook you,
Yeah.
right? Because I mean, we can get caught up in what is the market doing today and what is Doge doing today and, et cetera. But all in all, and again, I'm so grateful. I mean, it's just a hindsight thing, but we captured this data from mid-February to early March. I mean, it couldn't have been a better time to be, sort of getting the sentiment. That was just lucky timing. But to the companies, I think what I would say is stay the course. I mean, you have a peer group that is staying the course. And if you are having to talk to your upper management about decisions. I hope you can use this data to reinforce that staying the course is the right thing to do. 73%, as I said before, of companies are saying their commitments are going to remain stable. And remember that this is not just a nice to do. It is something that, consumer sentiment and in general the marketplace are looking for companies to stay engaged. And so, being a purpose-driven company not only is a requirement, but also 89% believe it is driving profit. So there is an ROI to these investments. So that's my advice to companies is to just continue to monitor the landscape, continue to double down with your goals and make sure you're getting the right measures and impacts to demonstrate that you're making a wise investment. And then to the nonprofits, what I would say is, first of all, I think the Doge cuts and the USAID and all of that stuff put an exclamation point on something that we know we're supposed to be doing, and that's revenue diversification. Revenue diversification is more important than ever before, and corporate engagement is a great area to focus for security and stability. Stay active in your outreach, right? So take care of those existing partners for sure. Make sure you're feeding them the measures and being a good partner, making it easy and a resource and watching the cost of the package. But a data point that we really didn't talk about earlier that I think is really germane here is that we asked the decision makers, how often do you make a decision? Is it like an annual thing? Is it like every 2 or 3 years? The vast majority, over 90%, work with multiple partners. Um, they make a decision because it's a good idea, not because it's first quarter and that's when I have my budget, right? So 68% of companies say that selecting new partners is based on when the right opportunity presents itself. So, what that says to me, to nonprofits, is in this revenue diversification strategy, think about additional partners where you can demonstrate mission brand alignment. Look at the partnership, look at the mission spaces they are supporting, find your unique partner value proposition and keep pitching. Don't let this be a time where you're like, well, I'm just going to go with my current partners. No, keep expanding that pipeline. There are decisions being made.
No, that's good advice, and that also I think it should hearten anyone, just in terms of what you say. And I do think even though nonprofits, they're still a business and they
Mhm.
still have to embody some of the business principles of sales and innovation and so on. And it sounds like, particularly according to your research, that they pay off. So, okay, so now it's crystal ball time, so what do you see ahead? Will the current environment change, or is this really a time when some fundamentals are getting better embedded? And I'd be curious as to what you think.